Underneath every moral posture, every act of charity, and every social obligation, there is a single, mechanical drive dictating human behavior. This is the architect of that theory. We are going to bypass his biography and the usual historical baggage attached to his name. Instead, we are treating his text purely as a structural dataset. His foundational claim is absolute. This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. This axiom strips away the traditional binary of good versus evil. It replaces moral judgments with a strict, singular mechanism of psychological motivation. Usually, these 19th century aphorisms are treated as poetic literature. We are going to process them differently, as a rigid, testable psychological model. To determine if this postulate actually holds up, we need to map its internal logic and benchmark it directly against modern empirical science. This matrix will serve as our comparative framework. We are plotting the text across three distinct categories. The first column represents the historical baseline, traditional social duty. These are the societal frameworks that prioritize collective obligation over individual desire. The second column holds our theoretical dataset. This is where we isolate the mechanics of the will to power itself. The third column is our modern benchmark, the current empirical understanding of human motivation dynamics. Running the text through this matrix will reveal whether we are dealing with archaic poetry or a highly accurate psychological schematic. There is immediate friction between the first two categories, the demands of traditional duty and the internal drive for power. The text attacks this friction head-on, asking, what destroys a man more quickly than to work, think, and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure? This diagram illustrates an automaton of duty, a system where overwhelming external pressure overrides the self, forcing action divorced from personal drive. To remain intact, the system demands inner necessity. The outward force of personal desire must actively resist the pressure of external obligations. Under this model, sacrificing your desires for the sake of obligation is not a noble moral achievement. It is a mechanical failure that degrades the human system. The text details the societal consequence of this failure. In loneliness, the lonely one eats himself. In a crowd, the many eat him. The collective acts as a parasite. By enforcing universal duty, the crowd sustains itself by leeching off the internal energy of the individual agent. Universal social duty, then, functions purely as an engine of psychological destruction. Let's isolate the theoretical model to test its internal logic and identify any structural faults. We hit a direct contradiction immediately. If the world and the self are made of the will to power and nothing besides, how can a person possibly act without inner necessity? It is a mechanical paradox. If human beings are constructed exclusively of this drive, it should be impossible to operate as an empty automaton. The resolution is that the automaton doesn't actually lack the will to power. Instead, their intrinsic drive has been completely hijacked and co-opted by the external demands of the crowd. This brings us to a second major paradox. The text states that we must recognize untruth as a condition of life. It is deeply ironic to construct a rigorously argued philosophical treatise only to claim that strict adherence to objective truth is hostile to living. The system resolves this by prioritizing biological and psychological utility. If a comfortable lie preserves the individual's drive better than an objective fact, the system demands the lie. By consciously embracing these contradictions and resisting accustomed values, the framework deliberately places itself, as the text explicitly states, beyond good and evil. Now we test the philosophical model by benchmarking it against 21st century empirical science. This node graph represents self-determination theory, the leading modern framework for understanding human drive. It divides our actions into two primary branches, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The 19th century demand for inner necessity maps directly onto the intrinsic motivation node. Modern clinical data proves that relying on extrinsic motivators, like societal reward or duty, actively degrades cognitive performance and psychological well-being. The text anticipates this entirely, rejecting the idea of universal solutions with the question, how can someone who can't save himself save others? It uses a precise structural metaphor. Supposing I have the key to your chains, why should your lock and my lock be the same? This aligns seamlessly with the modern psychological requirement for autonomy. Psychological health is strictly non-transferable. The specific internal drive that optimizes one individual will not operate the machinery of another. Despite its archaic phrasing, the core mechanics of this aphoristic dataset perfectly match current clinical standards for optimal psychological functioning. We can now dissolve the comparative matrix and build the final, unified output of the philosophical system we have mapped. This integrated psychological state is defined in the text as the higher man. This state requires 3 specific inputs. The first is the total rejection of universal duty. The second input is the radical individualization of purpose, ensuring that internal drives remain autonomous and uncorrupted. Maintaining these strict boundaries is difficult. The author notes that this is the hardest of all, to close the open hand out of love and keep modest as a giver. The final required input is a readiness to challenge misfortune. A stable system requires the strict acceptance of suffering as an operational necessity. This resulting state is not a model for political domination. It is a blueprint for achieving total psychological independence from the crowd. Operating effectively within this state requires absolute fearlessness in the face of inevitable isolation. True resilience cannot be engineered through collective morality or external obligations. It requires a brutally individualized alignment of your own internal drives.